"Mom, why doesn't Dad ever cook for me?" The question landed softly, almost innocent, but it stayed in the air like something heavier, something unfinished, as Emily Carter froze with a plastic spoon in her hand, staring down at the small pot of watered-down soup on her stove, the fluorescent kitchen light buzzing faintly above her like it had something to say but never would. And for a moment she didn't answer because she didn't know how to explain absence to a 5-year-old who still believed every silence had a reason. Noah sat at the tiny table, his legs swinging slightly, his small frame wrapped in an oversized hoodie that used to belong to her, his cheeks flushed from a lingering fever, his eyes too bright for a child who hadn't slept through the night in days. And Emily forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes as she stirred the pot again, slower this time, like maybe if she kept moving, the question would dissolve into the steam rising from the thin broth. But it didn't, it lingered, just like the stack of unpaid bills on the counter, just like the eviction notice folded neatly beside them, just like the quiet fears she carried in her chest every time Noah coughed a little too hard. Outside, a car door slammed and footsteps echoed down the narrow hallway of the apartment building, followed by a muffled voice complaining about noise, and Emily's shoulders tensed instinctively because she already knew what was coming. The knock came sharp and impatient. 3 quick hits that didn't wait for permission, and when she opened the door just a crack, the neighbor stood there with crossed arms and tired eyes, complaining about the coughing again, about the noise, about how some people had work in the morning, and Emily nodded, apologizing softly, promising it wouldn't happen again even though she knew it would, because sickness didn't follow schedules and hunger didn't respect quiet hours, and when she closed the door, she leaned her forehead against it for just a second longer than necessary before turning back to the kitchen where Noah was watching her with that quiet, searching look that children had when they knew something wasn't right but trusted you to fix it anyway. She walked over, crouched beside him, brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, her fingers lingering just a little as if checking his temperature without wanting him to notice, and then she stood again, reaching for the salt even though she knew there wasn't enough food to fix with seasoning, and the room felt smaller somehow, like the walls were inching closer, like the air was getting thinner, like everything in her life was tightening into a space she couldn't escape. And still she moved, because stopping wasn't an option, because giving up wasn't something she allowed herself to consider, because even when she was exhausted down to the bone, there was still a small boy at the table who needed dinner, needed warmth, needed something she wasn't sure she could keep giving. The stove clicked softly as the flame flickered, casting shadows that danced along the worn cabinets, and Emily stared at the pot again. Her reflection faint in the metal surface, tired eyes, pale skin, a quiet kind of strength that didn't look like strength at all, and somewhere deep inside her, beneath the fatigue and the fear and the constant pressure, there was something else, something stubborn, something unbreakable, something that whispered she would get through this no matter how many times the world told her she couldn't. And as Noah coughed again, softer this time, she turned quickly, her voice gentle, steady. The kind of voice that held everything together even when nothing else did. "Dinner's almost ready, sweetheart," she said, even though she knew it wasn't much, even though she knew it wasn't enough. But for now, it was all she had, and she gave it anyway. The spoon trembled slightly in Emily's hand as she poured the thin soup into a chipped bowl, the liquid too light, too quiet, like it knew it was not enough, and she placed it gently in front of Noah as if care alone could make it fuller, warmer, stronger, and he smiled anyway, that small, trusting smile that made something tighten in her chest, because he did not complain, he never did. He simply picked up his spoon and took a careful bite, his shoulders relaxing just a little as the warmth reached him. And for a brief moment the room felt softer, like the world had decided to give them a pause, just a small one, but even pauses did not last long in lives like theirs. The old heater in the corner rattled weakly, struggling against the chill creeping in through the thin windows, and Emily pulled her cardigan tighter around herself, watching Noah closely, counting his breaths without meaning to, the way mothers did when worry became second nature. And when he coughed again, quieter this time but still there, she reached for the bottle of medicine on the counter, tilting it slightly, hoping for one more dose, but the bottle was almost empty, just a thin line of liquid clinging to the bottom, and she hesitated, calculating silently, measuring time against need. wondering if she should save it for later or give it now, and that simple decision felt heavier than it should have. Like everything lately carried more weight than it used to. "Mom, it tastes good," Noah said softly, looking up at her with a kind of earnestness that only children had, and Emily nodded quickly, forcing a small laugh, brushing it off as if his words did not feel like both comfort and heartbreak at the same time, and she sat across from him, resting her elbows lightly on the table, pretending to eat from her own emptied bowl just so he would not notice, just so he would not ask questions she could not answer. Outside, a car engine started, headlights briefly sweeping across the wall through the blinds, and Emily's eyes followed the light instinctively, drawn to movement, to anything beyond the small space she had been confined to for too long, and for a second she imagined what it would feel like to just walk out, to step into a different life where things were easier, where food was not measured and medicine was not rationed, but the thought faded quickly, replaced by the quiet reality in front of her, the small table, the dim light. The boy who depended on her for everything, and she exhaled. Slowly, grounding herself again. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second sounding louder than the last, and Emily stood, walking to the sink, rinsing the spoon even though it did not need it. Just to keep her hands busy, just to avoid the stillness that always brought thoughts she did not want to face, and as she turned off the faucet, she caught a glimpse of herself in the small, scratched mirror above it, her hair loosely tied back, strands falling out, her eyes tired but alert, always alert, like rest was something she had forgotten how to do, and she looked at that reflection for a moment longer than usual, searching for something. Maybe strength, maybe reassurance, maybe just proof that she was still holding on. Behind her, Noah's voice came again, softer now, drifting with the kind of sleepiness that followed warmth and exhaustion. "Mom, will you stay with me tonight?" And she turned immediately, her expression softening, crossing the small distance between them in 2 quick steps, kneeling beside his chair, her hand finding his without hesitation. "I am right here," she said quietly, her voice steady in a way her heart was not, and he nodded, satisfied with that answer, because for him it was enough, because for him she was enough, and as she helped him to the worn couch they used as a bed, pulling the blanket up around him carefully, tucking it in like it was something valuable, something fragile, she sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his back, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing, slow, uneven, but there, still there, and she stayed like that, watching, listening, waiting. Because sometimes love was not loud or grand or noticed. Sometimes it was just this, sitting in a quiet room, holding on through the small hours, hoping that tomorrow would somehow be kinder than today. The night stretched longer than it should have, quiet but never truly still, the kind of quiet that carried every small sound with it, the ticking clock, the faint hum of the heater, the soft, uneven rhythm of Noah's breathing as he slept against the worn cushions, and Emily remained there beside him, her back slightly curved, her hand resting gently on his shoulder as if even in sleep he might drift away without that contact. And she did not dare close her eyes for more than a few seconds at a time, because every cough pulled her back instantly, every shift in his breathing made her sit up straighter, listening, measuring, hoping. Sometime past midnight, the temperature seemed to drop another degree, the kind of cold that slipped in quietly through cracks in the window frame, settling into the floorboards, climbing slowly into the air, and Emily reached for the extra blanket folded over the armrest, draping it carefully over Noah without waking him, tucking it around his small frame with practiced precision, and when her fingers brushed his cheek, she paused, feeling the warmth there, still too warm, and her jaw tightened just slightly as she leaned back, exhaling slowly through her nose, steady, controlled, like she had learned to do when worry threatened to rise too quickly. The room smelled faintly of soup and old wood and something else, something like fatigue that had settled into every surface, and Emily shifted her position, her muscles stiff from hours of sitting, her body reminding her that she had not rested properly in days. But she ignored it, because there were things more important than comfort, there always were, and she reached for her phone on the table, the screen lighting up softly in the dark, illuminating her face just enough to show the tension in her eyes as she opened her banking app again, even though she already knew what she would see, even though the numbers had not changed since the last time she checked, and the balance stared back at her. Small and unyielding, a quiet reminder of limits. She could not push any further. She closed the app quickly, as if looking at it longer might make it worse, and instead scrolled through old messages, stopping briefly on one that had not been opened in months, her thumb hovering over the screen before she locked the phone again, setting it down without reading, because some doors, once opened, made everything harder to hold together, and she did not have space for that tonight. Across the room, the faint glow from the streetlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin lines across the wall, and Emily watched them absent-mindedly, her thoughts drifting just enough to feel the weight of everything pressing in at once: the rent, the medicine, the job she had barely managed to keep after missing too many shifts, the quiet judgment in her manager's eyes, the way people looked at her when Noah coughed in public, as if she had failed in some visible, undeniable way. And she swallowed that thought quickly, because failure was not something she allowed herself to accept, not when there was still something she could do, even if it was small, even if it was not enough. A sudden cough broke the stillness again, sharper this time, and Emily leaned forward immediately, her hand returning to Noah's back, rubbing gentle circles the way she had learned soothed him, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke, not really to wake him but to anchor him. "It is okay, I am right here." And his breathing steadied slowly, the tension easing just a little beneath her palm, and she stayed like that, counting the seconds between each breath again, her own breathing unconsciously matching his, as if she could guide him through it just by staying close. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time had a way of blurring when she was like this, caught between exhaustion and alertness, and eventually the coughing stopped, leaving only the soft rise and fall of his chest, and Emily allowed herself to lean back slightly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction as the immediate worry faded, replaced by the deeper, quieter kind that never fully went away, and she looked down at him. Really looked, at the small lines of strain even in sleep, at the way his hand still clutched the edge of the blanket, and something inside her shifted, not breaking, never breaking, but hardening in a different way, a quiet resolve forming beneath everything else, because no matter how thin the soup was, no matter how empty the medicine bottle became, no matter how heavy the world pressed down on her, she would find a way to keep him safe, to keep him warm, to keep him here. And as the clock ticked on and the night slowly edged toward morning, Emily Carter did not move from that spot, because for now, staying was the only thing she could give, and she gave it completely. Morning did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly through the thin blinds, a pale gray light that softened the edges of the room but did nothing to warm it, and Emily felt it before she saw it, the subtle shift in the air, the quiet signal that another day had begun whether she was ready for it or not, and she blinked carefully, her eyes dry from too little sleep, her body heavy in that way that came from resting without ever truly relaxing, and for a moment she stayed still, listening again, always listening, until she heard it, the slow, steady breathing from the couch, not perfect, not fully calm, but stable enough to let her exhale just a little. She turned her head slightly, her gaze settling on Noah, his small form curled beneath the blanket, one hand still gripping the edge like it was something solid in a world that shifted too easily, and she reached out, brushing her fingers lightly over his hair, careful not to wake him, measuring his temperature again without needing a thermometer, just instinct. Just habit, and the warmth was still there, but less sharp than before, less urgent, and she let herself take that as a small victory, the kind that did not solve anything but still mattered more than it should have. The clock read 6:12 a.m., and Emily sat up slowly, her back protesting the movement, her muscles tight from the night spent half awake, and she pressed her hand briefly against her lower back before standing, moving quietly across the room so the floorboards would not creak too loudly, each step deliberate, controlled, as if even the smallest noise might undo the fragile peace they had managed to hold on to. The kitchen looked the same as it had hours ago, the pot still in the sink, the counter still cluttered, the bottle of medicine still nearly empty, and Emily paused there, staring at it again, as if overnight it might have changed, as if something might have appeared to make the day easier, but it had not, and she reached for it anyway, tilting it once more, watching the last thin line of liquid shift along the glass. And this time she did not hesitate, she set it back down firmly, her jaw tightening slightly, because decisions would have to be made soon, and waiting would not change the outcome. Outside, the distant sound of traffic began to build, low at first, then gradually louder, the city waking up around them, people heading to jobs, to routines, to lives that moved forward whether or not they were ready, and Emily glanced toward the door, toward the world beyond it, feeling that familiar pull between staying and going, between protecting what she had and risking it for something more, and she closed her eyes briefly. Steadying herself before opening them again with quiet determination, she moved back to the couch, kneeling beside Noah as he stirred slightly, his brow furrowing before his eyes opened slowly, still heavy with sleep, and he looked at her with that same trust, that same quiet expectation, and Emily smiled gently, softer than she felt. "Good morning," she whispered, brushing her thumb lightly across his cheek, and he blinked, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning, Mom," before coughing again, weaker than before but still there, and she nodded as if it was nothing, as if it did not tighten something inside her every time it happened. She helped him sit up slowly, adjusting the blanket around his shoulders, her movements careful, practiced, and as he leaned into her slightly, she felt how light he was, how much of him depended on her holding steady, and she always did, even when everything else felt uncertain, and she glanced toward the small kitchen again, already calculating, already planning, already searching for a way to stretch what little they had into something that could carry them through another day. The light grew stronger, filling the room with a dull, steady brightness that revealed every worn surface, every small crack, every sign of a life held together with effort and patience. And Emily stood again, reaching for the kettle this time, filling it with water, setting it on the stove, the simple routine grounding her in a way nothing else could, and as the faint sound of heating water began, she rested her hands lightly on the counter, her head lowering just slightly, not in defeat, never that, but in preparation, in focus, in the quiet gathering of strength she would need, because today would ask more of her, just like every day did, and she would answer the same way she always had, by showing up, by holding on, by refusing to let the weight of everything push her into stillness. And as Noah watched her from the couch, wrapped in the blanket, his small voice breaking the quiet again, "Mom, are we going outside today?" She turned, meeting his eyes, and for a moment there was a pause, a calculation, 1,000 thoughts moving at once, before she nodded gently, her voice calm, certain, even if she did not yet know how. "Yes, we are." Because sometimes hope was not something you felt, it was something you chose, and she chose it again, right there, in that small kitchen, at the start of another day. The kettle clicked softly as it reached a boil, a small, ordinary sound that filled the quiet kitchen, and Emily moved quickly to pour the hot water into a chipped mug, dropping in a tea bag she had already used once before, watching the color slowly spread through the water like it was trying to become something stronger than it really was, and she wrapped her hands around the mug for a moment, letting the warmth seep into her fingers before turning back toward Noah, who was sitting up now, his blanket still wrapped tightly around his shoulders, his eyes following her every movement with quiet curiosity. "We need to get some fresh air today," she said gently, more to herself than to him, but he nodded anyway, as if he understood the importance of something beyond the words, and she smiled faintly, setting the mug down on the counter before walking over to him, kneeling again to pull a clean shirt over his head, her movements careful, steady, adjusting the fabric so it would not irritate his skin, brushing down the sleeves like that small gesture could smooth out everything else. Outside, the sunlight had grown stronger, pushing through the blinds in brighter lines now, and when she finally opened the door, the hallway greeted her with that familiar mix of stale air and distant voices, the building already alive with people starting their day, doors opening and closing, footsteps echoing along the narrow space. And Emily held Noah's hand tightly as they stepped out, closing the door behind them with a soft click that felt more final than it should have. Like leaving always carried a quiet risk of not returning the same way. The stairs creaked beneath their feet as they made their way down slowly, Emily adjusting her pace to match Noah's, one hand steady at his back just in case. And when they reached the ground floor, the outside air hit them immediately, cooler than she expected but cleaner, fresher. carrying the distant scent of coffee from somewhere down the street, and Noah took a small breath, deeper than before, his shoulders lifting slightly as if the air itself offered him something the apartment could not. The street was already busy, cars passing in steady intervals, people walking with purpose, their conversations blending into a low, constant hum, and Emily guided Noah carefully along the sidewalk, her eyes scanning everything out of habit, noting the cracks in the pavement, the uneven edges, the small details that could trip him if she was not paying attention, and as they walked, she noticed how light his hand felt in hers, how each step he took seemed to require just a little more effort than it should, and she slowed down even further, adjusting without making it obvious, because she did not want him to feel fragile, even if he was. They passed a small convenience store on the corner, the bell above the door chiming every time someone entered or left, and Emily paused just for a second, her eyes flicking toward the window where rows of supplies lined the shelves, medicine, food, things that looked so simple behind glass but felt impossibly far from reach, and she swallowed quietly, tightening her grip on Noah's hand before guiding him forward again, choosing movement over hesitation, because stopping too long meant thinking too much, and thinking too much led to places she could not afford to go. A few steps later, Noah tugged gently at her sleeve, his voice soft but hopeful. "Mom, can we sit for a minute?" And she nodded immediately, scanning for a place, spotting a small bench near the edge of a quiet park just ahead, and they made their way toward it slowly, the distance not far but feeling longer with each step he took, and when they finally sat down, Emily exhaled quietly, watching as Noah leaned back slightly, his face turned toward the sunlight, his eyes closing for a brief moment as if he was soaking it in, like warmth alone could help him recover, and she sat beside him, her hand still resting lightly on his, her gaze drifting across the park where a few children played in the distance, their laughter carrying faintly through the air. And for a moment she allowed herself to imagine Noah there, running, laughing, breathing easily without the weight he carried now, and the image stayed with her longer than she expected, settling somewhere deep inside, not as a reminder of what was missing, but as something she would fight for, something she would not let go of, no matter how difficult the path became. And as the city moved around them, busy and indifferent, Emily Carter sat on that small bench, holding her son's hand, quietly gathering the strength she would need for whatever came next. The sunlight shifted slowly across the bench, warming one side more than the other, and Emily adjusted slightly so it would fall over Noah's shoulders instead of her own, a small instinctive movement that said everything about where her priorities rested, and he did not notice the shift. He simply leaned a little closer into her side, his breathing still uneven but calmer than it had been inside the apartment. And for a few quiet minutes neither of them spoke, letting the sounds of the park settle around them, the distant laughter of children, the soft rustle of leaves moving in the light breeze, the steady rhythm of footsteps passing by without pause, and Emily watched it all with a kind of distant awareness, present but not fully part of it, like she existed just outside the edges of this ordinary morning. A dog barked somewhere across the path, sharp but brief, followed by the low murmur of its owner calling it back. And Noah opened his eyes slightly, his gaze drifting toward the sound before returning to her, his expression thoughtful in a way that felt older than it should have been, and he spoke quietly. "Mom, do you think I can run again soon?" And the question landed gently, without complaint, without demand, just a simple hope placed carefully between them, and Emily felt it settle in her chest, heavy and fragile at the same time, and she did not answer right away, not because she did not want to, but because she needed to choose her words carefully, to find something that was honest without taking anything away from him. She brushed her hand lightly over his hair again, her voice calm and steady when it came. "You will, just not today." And he nodded slowly, accepting that answer the way children sometimes did, trusting the future even when the present was uncertain, and he leaned back again, his head resting against her arm, his eyes closing once more as if even that small conversation had taken something out of him. Emily looked out across the park again, her gaze settling on a small group of people gathered near the entrance, dressed differently than the others, more polished, more deliberate in their movements. And among them stood a man whose presence seemed to shift the space around him without effort, tall, composed, his posture relaxed but purposeful, and she might not have noticed him at all if not for the way others seemed to respond, subtle adjustments, glances, a quiet awareness that followed him even when he did nothing to demand it. He spoke briefly to someone beside him, his voice too low to carry, but his expression calm, attentive, and then his eyes lifted, scanning the area in a way that felt less like searching and more like observing, taking in details without lingering, and for a brief moment, his gaze passed over the bench where Emily and Noah sat, not stopping, not changing, just a flicker of awareness before moving on, and Emily felt something shift in that instant, not recognition, not connection, just the subtle awareness of being seen, even if only for a second, and she looked away quickly, focusing instead on Noah. Adjusting the blanket around him again even though it did not need adjusting, the man turned slightly, continuing his conversation, and as he moved, the sunlight caught briefly on the edge of his watch, a small flash that disappeared as quickly as it came, and Emily exhaled quietly, grounding herself again in the present, because people like that existed in a different world, one that did not intersect with hers, not really, not in any way that mattered, and she had learned long ago not to linger on those differences, not to measure her life against something that was never meant for her. Beside her, Noah stirred again, his fingers tightening slightly around hers, and she looked down immediately, her attention returning fully to him. Because no matter what existed beyond this bench, beyond this park, beyond this moment, this was what mattered, this small hand in hers, this quiet breath, this fragile balance she was holding together one choice at a time, and she shifted slightly, leaning closer so he could rest more comfortably, her presence steady, unwavering, and as the morning continued to unfold around them, Emily Carter remained exactly where she was, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because for now, staying was still the safest place she knew how to be. A breeze moved gently through the park, just enough to stir the leaves above them and carry a faint chill that made Emily instinctively pull the edge of the blanket higher around Noah's shoulders, her fingers tucking it in with quiet precision, and he shifted slightly, leaning more fully into her side as if her presence alone could shield him from everything beyond that moment, and she let him, adjusting her posture so he would not feel the strain in her arm, because even small discomforts were things she learned to ignore when it came to him. The path in front of them remained busy, people passing in steady rhythms, some alone, some in pairs, conversations blending into a low hum that rose and fell like background noise in a life that never paused, and Emily watched them without really seeing them, her focus anchored in the weight of Noah against her and the slow pattern of his breathing. But then a shift in movement caught her attention again, not loud, not sudden, just different, and she glanced up briefly, noticing the same man from earlier now walking along the edge of the path, no longer surrounded by others, his pace unhurried, his gaze directed forward but observant in a way that suggested he noticed more than he showed. He passed a group of children playing near the grass, slowing just slightly as one of them laughed loudly, the sound bright and unfiltered, and there was a brief softness in his expression, subtle but real, before it faded back into that composed calm, and as he continued walking, his eyes lifted again, scanning ahead, and this time they paused, just for a fraction longer. When they reached the bench where Emily and Noah sat, Emily felt it again, that quiet awareness of being seen, and she straightened slightly, not out of discomfort but instinct, her hand tightening just a little around Noah's, and the man did not approach immediately, he simply slowed his pace as if considering something, his gaze shifting briefly to Noah, taking in the blanket, the pale complexion, the small details that told a story without words, and then to Emily, whose expression remained calm but guarded. The kind of calm that came from learning not to expect anything from strangers. For a moment, the space between them held something unspoken, not tension exactly, but a quiet recognition of difference, of distance, of lives that did not usually intersect, and Emily lowered her gaze again, focusing on Noah, brushing her thumb lightly across his knuckles in a steady, grounding motion, signaling without words that she was still there, still present, still in control of what she could control. The man took another step forward, then stopped, his posture relaxed but deliberate, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, even, carrying just enough to reach her without drawing attention from others nearby. "Is he all right?" The question was simple, direct, without assumption or intrusion, and Emily looked up again, meeting his gaze this time, her eyes steady despite the quiet exhaustion behind them, and there was a brief pause before she answered, not because she was unsure, but because she chose her words carefully. "He will be," she said, her tone firm but not defensive, a statement of belief more than certainty, and the man nodded slightly, acknowledging the answer without pressing further, as if he understood that some things did not need explanation. Noah stirred at the sound of voices, his eyes opening slowly, blinking against the light, and he looked up at the unfamiliar figure with quiet curiosity, not fear, just the simple awareness of someone new, and Emily felt his fingers tighten around hers again, and she gave a small reassuring squeeze in return, her attention split between him and the man standing a few steps away. The air seemed to settle around them in that moment, the background noise fading just enough to make the exchange feel more defined, more present, and the man glanced briefly toward the small convenience store across the street, then back at them, as if connecting pieces in his mind, not making assumptions, just observing, and Emily watched him carefully, her posture still composed but alert in the way that came from protecting what mattered most, and though nothing had changed yet, not in any visible way, there was a subtle shift in the air, something quiet. Something just beginning, like the first note of a story that had not yet revealed where it would lead, and Emily Carter remained exactly where she was, grounded, steady, her hands still wrapped around her son's, holding on to the only certainty she allowed herself to trust. The moment lingered longer than expected, not uncomfortable but not easy either, as if something invisible had settled between them that neither side was willing to disturb too quickly, and Emily held her ground quietly, her posture calm, her hands still wrapped around Noah's, her focus anchored in the simple act of being present, while the man studied them with a kind of attention that did not feel intrusive, just careful. Measured, like he was trying to understand without asking too much. Noah shifted again, his small fingers tightening slightly around his mother's hand before loosening as he looked up at the man, his expression open, curious in the way children often were before the world taught them to be cautious, and he spoke softly, his voice still carrying the faint rasp of illness. "I am okay," as if answering the question that had already been asked, and the man's gaze softened just slightly at that, not in a way that drew attention, but enough that it changed the tone of the space around them. Emily noticed it, the subtle shift, and she straightened just a little more, her instincts balancing between gratitude and distance, because kindness from strangers was something she had learned to accept carefully, never fully trusting it to stay, and the man seemed to understand that boundary without being told, because he did not step closer, he did not reach out. He simply stood there for a second longer before glancing again toward the convenience store across the street, his expression thoughtful now, as if a quiet decision was forming beneath the surface. "There is a pharmacy inside that store," he said after a moment, his voice even, neutral, offering information rather than advice, and Emily followed his gaze briefly before returning her attention to him, her eyes steady, her tone polite but firm. "I know," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty, just a quiet statement that carried more meaning than the words themselves, and the man nodded again, acknowledging it without pushing further, because he understood what she was really saying, that she was aware of what her son needed, that she had already thought of it, that the problem was not knowledge but something else entirely. The air between them settled again, the sounds of the park drifting back in, footsteps passing, distant laughter. The ordinary rhythm of a day that continued whether or not anyone paused, and the man took a small step back, not retreating but giving space, respecting the invisible line she had drawn, and for a moment it seemed like the interaction would end there, just a brief exchange between strangers who would return to their separate paths without consequence. But then Noah coughed again, softer than before but still present, and Emily's hand moved instinctively, rubbing gentle circles on his back, her attention fully on him. And she did not see the way the man's expression shifted again, more focused. Now more certain, as if that small detail confirmed something he had already begun to understand. He reached into his coat pocket slowly, not in a way that startled or drew attention, just a natural movement, and then paused, his hand resting there for a second before withdrawing it empty, as if reconsidering whatever he had intended to do, and instead he looked back at Emily, meeting her gaze one last time, his voice calm but carrying a quiet weight now. "Sometimes help does not have to be asked for," he said, not as a lesson, not as pressure, just as a simple statement placed carefully between them, and Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, her expression unreadable but steady, and then she gave a small nod, not agreement, not refusal, just acknowledgement, because she understood the words even if she was not ready to accept what they implied. The man inclined his head slightly in return, a gesture of respect more than anything else, and then he turned, stepping back onto the path, his movements unhurried as he continued walking away, blending once again into the flow of people moving through the park. And Emily watched him go for a brief moment, not because she expected anything more, but because something about the encounter had left a trace, something quiet but noticeable, like a ripple that had not yet settled. Beside her, Noah leaned gently against her arm again, his breathing steadying once more, and she looked down at him, her hand tightening just slightly around his, grounding herself again in what she knew, what she could hold, what she could control, and as the morning continued around them, Emily Carter remained on that bench, her world still small, still fragile, but now carrying the faint echo of something different, something that had not changed anything yet, but somehow felt like it might. For a while after he left, nothing seemed different on the surface. The park continued its quiet rhythm, people passing, children laughing, the distant hum of the city moving forward without pause, and Emily remained seated on the bench, her hand still holding Noah's, her posture unchanged, but something inside her had shifted just slightly, not enough to define, not enough to trust. Just a faint awareness that the moment had not ended as simply as it appeared. Noah leaned closer against her, sighed, his breathing more even now, his small frame relaxing into the warmth of the sunlight, and Emily adjusted the blanket again, smoothing it over his shoulders as if the gesture itself could shield him from everything beyond that small space, and she glanced briefly toward the path where the man had disappeared, her eyes searching without meaning to, but there was nothing there now, just the steady flow of strangers moving through their own lives. "Mom, are we going home soon?" Noah asked quietly, his voice softer now, carrying that familiar edge of fatigue, and Emily looked down at him, brushing her fingers lightly across his cheek before nodding gently. "In a little while," she said, her tone calm, reassuring, even though she had not fully decided yet, even though part of her hesitated at the thought of returning to the apartment where the air felt heavier, where the walls seemed to close in more with each passing hour, but she knew they could not stay here forever. Even if this small moment of peace felt easier than what waited beyond it, she shifted slightly, stretching her legs, her body reminding her again of the strain it had carried through the night, and she exhaled slowly, steadying herself before reaching into her pocket for her phone, checking the time, calculating silently how long they had been out, how long they could remain, how much energy Noah still had left, and as she did, her eyes drifted once more across the street toward the convenience store, the glass windows reflecting the movement of passing cars, the door opening and closing in steady intervals as people stepped in and out without hesitation. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to consider it again, the shelves inside, the medicine, the food, the simple solutions that felt just out of reach, and her fingers tightened slightly around the phone before she slipped it back into her pocket, her gaze lowering as she drew in a quiet breath, because thinking about it did not change anything, and she had learned not to linger on what she could not fix in that moment. Beside her, Noah shifted again, his small hand tugging lightly at hers, and she turned her attention back to him immediately, her focus sharpening, her voice gentle. "Are you tired?" she asked, and he nodded slowly, his eyes half closed now, and she smiled softly, brushing his hair back once more. "Then we will head back soon," she said, more certain this time, because decisions, once made, were easier to carry than questions left unanswered. She stood carefully, helping him to his feet, keeping one hand steady at his side as he found his balance, and together they took a few slow steps away from the bench, the distance small but deliberate, and as they moved, Emily felt the weight of the day settling back in, the quiet responsibilities waiting, The choices that would need to be made before evening came again, but she held on to the small steadiness she had found here, the brief calm that had given her just enough strength to keep moving. They reached the edge of the path, pausing for a moment as Emily glanced once more toward the street, her eyes scanning the area instinctively, and for a split second, something caught her attention, not a person exactly. Not a clear movement, just a subtle shift near the entrance of the convenience store, like a figure passing just out of view, and she hesitated, her gaze lingering there a moment longer than necessary, before she shook it off gently, guiding Noah forward again, because whatever it was, whatever it might have meant, it was not something she could hold on to, not yet, and as they began the slow walk back toward their building, Emily Carter carried with her the same quiet determination she had always relied on, steady, unspoken, and just strong enough to face whatever waited behind that door. The walk back felt longer than it should have, each step measured not by distance but by how much strength Noah had left, and Emily adjusted her pace instinctively, slowing when his grip on her hand tightened, pausing briefly when his breathing grew uneven, her attention fixed entirely on the small signals he could not always put into words, and the city moved around them without noticing, cars passing, doors opening, conversations blending into the steady hum of a day that did not wait for anyone to catch up. When they reached the building, Emily pushed the door open carefully, the familiar creak echoing softly in the narrow hallway, and the air inside felt heavier immediately, warmer but stale, carrying the faint scent of old walls and lived-in spaces that never fully cleared, and Noah leaned closer into her side as they stepped in, his energy fading with each movement, and she guided him gently toward the stairs, one hand steady at his back, the other holding his. Her posture firm despite the quiet strain in her shoulders. The climb was slow, each step deliberate, and when they reached their floor, Emily paused for just a second, letting Noah catch his breath before unlocking the door, the soft click sounding louder than usual in the stillness, and as they stepped inside, the apartment greeted them exactly as they had left it, unchanged, quiet, the morning light now stretching further across the floor, revealing every worn surface with more clarity than before. She closed the door behind them gently, her hand lingering on the handle for a moment, as if holding on to the outside air just a little longer, before turning back, her focus returning immediately to Noah, who had already moved toward the couch, his movements slower now, heavier, and she crossed the room quickly, helping him settle back down, pulling the blanket over him once more, adjusting it carefully around his shoulders as he sank into the cushions with a soft exhale. "Just rest," she said quietly, her voice steady, and he nodded faintly, his eyes closing almost immediately, the effort of the walk having taken what little energy he had left, and Emily remained beside him for a moment, watching his breathing again, counting without thinking, waiting for it to settle into something more even, something she could trust. The room felt smaller again now, the quiet different from the park, heavier, more enclosed, and Emily stood slowly, moving toward the kitchen, her steps quieter than before, as if not to disturb the fragile calm that had returned, and she reached for the kettle again out of habit, filling it halfway, setting it on the stove even though she did not know what she would use it for, the simple act of doing something, anything, helping her stay grounded. As she turned back toward the counter, something caught her eye, a small detail that had not been there before, and she paused, her gaze narrowing slightly as she took a step closer, her attention sharpening, because on the edge of the counter, near the sink where she had stood that morning, there was a paper bag, plain, unmarked, its presence quiet but undeniable, and for a moment she simply stared at it, her mind searching for an explanation, retracing her steps, her memory, but there was nothing, no moment where she had brought it in, no reason it should be there. She moved closer slowly, her hand hovering just above it before she touched it lightly, as if expecting it to disappear, but it did not, it remained solid beneath her fingers, and she glanced back toward the door instinctively, the lock still in place, the room still silent, and a quiet realization settled in, not sudden, not dramatic, just clear. And she looked down at the bag again, her hand tightening slightly around its edge as she opened it carefully, her movements slow, controlled, as if whatever was inside carried weight beyond its size. Inside, neatly placed, were items she recognized immediately, A small box of children's medicine, a container of fresh food, simple but substantial, and for a second her breath caught, not from surprise alone but from the quiet precision of it, the way it matched exactly what they needed without excess, without show. And she stood there in the small kitchen, the light from the window falling across the counter, illuminating the contents of the bag, and something shifted inside her again, deeper this time, not just awareness, not just curiosity, but something closer to understanding, something that connected the quiet words spoken in the park with the silent action now placed before her, and she closed her eyes briefly, her hand resting on the edge of the counter, grounding herself before opening them again. Because this, whatever it was, whatever it meant, had just changed. Something, even if she did not yet know how far that change would reach. Emily did not move for several seconds, her hand still resting lightly on the edge of the counter, her eyes fixed on the contents of the bag as if looking away might cause it to disappear, and the quiet of the apartment seemed to deepen around her, the faint ticking of the clock growing louder in the stillness, grounding her in the reality of what she was seeing. She reached into the bag slowly, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the medicine box, lifting it carefully as if it carried more than just its weight, and she turned it slightly, reading the label, confirming what she already knew, that it was exactly what Noah needed, not a substitute, not something close, but the right one, the one she had been trying to stretch, to save, to make last longer than it should have, and her breath caught just slightly as that realization settled in. She set the medicine down gently on the counter, her movements deliberate, controlled, and reached for the container of food next, opening it just enough to see the contents inside, fresh, warm, prepared in a way that felt intentional, not random, not careless, and she closed it again quickly, her hand pausing for a moment on the lid as if steadying herself, because this was not just help, this was understanding, this was someone seeing exactly what was missing and filling it without asking, without announcing, without expecting anything in return. Behind her, Noah shifted slightly on the couch, a soft sound escaping him as he adjusted under the blanket. And Emily turned immediately, her attention snapping back to him, her instincts overriding everything else, and she crossed the room in a few quick steps, kneeling beside him again, her hand returning to its familiar place on his back, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing, and for the first time since morning, she felt something change in that rhythm, not dramatically, not perfectly, but enough to notice, enough to ease the tightness in her chest just a little. She reached for the medicine, measuring the dose carefully, her hands steady now in a way they had not been before, and when she gently woke him, guiding him to sit up just enough to take it, he did not resist, his eyes still heavy with sleep, trusting her completely, and she held the small cup to his lips, watching as he swallowed, her gaze never leaving him until it was done, until she was sure, and then she helped him settle back down again, adjusting the blanket once more, her touch lingering for a second longer than necessary. She moved back to the kitchen slowly, her steps quieter now, more grounded, and she picked up the container of food again, opening it fully this time, the warmth still there, the faint aroma filling the small space. And she paused, her eyes closing briefly as she took in that simple detail, because it had been a long time since something in this apartment felt fresh, felt intentional, felt like care instead of survival. She prepared a small portion, moving with quiet efficiency, and when she returned to Noah, she sat beside him, waiting patiently until he stirred again, offering him a few careful bites, watching closely as he ate, slower at first, then with a little more ease, and when he looked up at her, a faint smile forming despite the lingering fatigue, something inside her shifted again, softer this time, less guarded, and she returned the smile gently, her eyes warm in a way they had not been in days. The room felt different now, not larger, not brighter, but lighter somehow, as if the weight pressing against the walls had eased just enough to let her breathe more fully, and Emily glanced back toward the kitchen, toward the bag still resting on the counter, its presence quiet but undeniable. And she understood now what had been left there, not just the items themselves, but the intention behind them, the respect in the silence, the way it had been given without taking anything from her in return. She lowered her gaze again, focusing on Noah as he settled back into the couch, his breathing steadying further, his small hand reaching out to find hers again, and she took it without hesitation, her grip firm but gentle, anchoring both of them in that moment. And as the afternoon light shifted slowly across the room, Emily Carter sat there, beside her son, holding on to something new, something fragile but real, a quiet understanding that sometimes help did not come with words, and sometimes, just sometimes, it arrived exactly when it was needed most. The afternoon settled into a quieter rhythm, the kind that came after something important had already happened, even if it had not been fully understood yet, and Emily remained seated beside Noah, her hand still resting lightly over his, her presence steady, grounded, while the faint sounds of the city filtered in through the thin walls, distant traffic, a door closing somewhere down the hall, voices that came and went without meaning. Noah slept more deeply now, his breathing smoother, more even than it had been all morning, and Emily noticed the difference immediately, not as a sudden change but as a gradual easing, a soft return to something closer to normal, and she watched him carefully, her eyes tracing the small movements of his chest, the way his shoulders no longer tensed with each breath, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself to lean back slightly, her body releasing a fraction of the tension it had been holding for hours. The light in the room had shifted. Again, warmer now, stretching across the floor and climbing slowly up the wall, and Emily turned her head toward the kitchen, her gaze settling once more on the paper bag still resting quietly on the counter, its presence no longer surprising but still significant, like something that had altered the balance of the room without making a sound, and she stood slowly, careful not to disturb Noah. Moving toward it with the same deliberate calm she had carried all day, she reached into the bag again. This time noticing details she had not fully taken in before, the quality of the items, the thought behind them, not extravagant, not excessive, but exact, as if whoever had left them understood not just what was needed, but how to give it without taking anything away from her dignity, and that realization settled deeper than anything else, because it was not just help, it was respect. She ran her fingers lightly along the edge of the container, the smooth surface catching the light, and for a brief moment, her reflection appeared faintly in it, her expression softer now, less guarded, though still careful, still aware, because trust was not something she gave easily, not anymore, but this. Whatever this was, had not asked for trust, it had simply acted, quietly, precisely, and left the rest up to her. Behind her, a soft sound drew her attention again, and she turned quickly, her instincts sharp, but it was only Noah shifting in his sleep, his hand moving slightly across the blanket as if searching for something, and she crossed the room immediately, taking his hand again, grounding him without waking him, her thumb brushing lightly across his skin in a familiar, reassuring motion. And he settled almost instantly, his breathing steadying again, his small frame relaxing back into the couch. Emily sat there beside him, her posture easing just a little more now, her shoulders lowering, her breath deeper, and she looked around the room again, seeing it differently than she had that morning, not because it had changed, but because something inside her had, a small shift, a quiet opening. Like a door that had been closed for too long finally allowing a thin line of light to pass through. She glanced once more toward the door, her mind tracing back through the day, the park, the conversation, the quiet presence of the man who had asked a simple question and left behind something far more meaningful than words, and she realized then that he had never tried to convince her, never pushed, never crossed the line she had drawn. He had simply seen what was needed and acted, leaving her with the choice to accept it or not. And that choice mattered more than the help itself. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking time in quiet increments, and Emily tightened her hand gently around Noah's, her gaze softening as she looked down at him, because whatever came next, whatever decisions she would have to make, whatever challenges still waited beyond this moment, she was not standing in the exact same place she had been before, and as the sunlight continued its slow movement across the room, Emily Carter remained there, present, steady, holding on to the quiet understanding that sometimes strength did not mean doing everything alone, and sometimes, just sometimes, it meant allowing something good to reach you without pushing it away. The evening arrived quietly, the light outside fading from warm gold to a softer gray that settled over the apartment like a calm that did not ask for anything in return, and Emily sat in the same place she had been for hours, her back resting lightly against the worn couch, her hand still loosely holding Noah's as he slept. But this time the stillness felt different, not heavy, not pressing in on her from all sides, but steady, almost protective. Like the room itself had softened around them. Noah's breathing was even now. Deeper, more relaxed than it had been in days, and Emily watched him for a long moment, not counting this time, not measuring, just observing, letting herself trust what she saw without questioning it, and when he stirred slightly, his eyes opening just a little, he looked up at her with that quiet clarity children sometimes had after rest, and he smiled, small but real. "Mom! I feel better," he said, his voice still soft but stronger than before, and Emily felt something shift inside her again, something that loosened the last tight thread of worry she had been holding on to, and she smiled back, her expression warm, genuine. "I know," she replied, her voice steady in a way that no longer required effort. She helped him sit up slowly, adjusting the blanket around his shoulders as he leaned into her side, and she reached for the food she had set aside earlier. Offering him a few more careful bites, watching as he ate with a little more energy this time, his movements no longer as slow, no longer as fragile, and she did not rush him, did not fill the silence with unnecessary words, because moments like this did not need to be explained, they simply needed to be felt. Across the room, the paper bag remained on the counter, quiet, unchanged, but no longer unfamiliar. And Emily glanced at it briefly, her gaze softer now, no longer searching for answers. Because she understood enough, not everything, not yet, but enough to know that what had been given was not meant to take anything away from her, only to support what she was already holding together. The clock ticked steadily, marking the quiet passage of time, and Emily leaned back slightly, allowing herself to rest against the couch fully now, her shoulders lowering in a way they had not all day, and she closed her eyes for just a moment, not out of exhaustion, but out of something closer to relief, a quiet acknowledgement that this day, which had started with so much weight, had shifted in a way she had not expected. Noah's hand tightened gently around hers, and she opened her eyes again, looking down at him, and he spoke softly, his voice thoughtful. "Mom, that man, do you think he is nice?" And Emily paused. Not because she did not have an answer, but because she wanted to give the right one, the one that would stay with him, and she nodded slowly, her gaze steady. "Yes," she said, her voice calm, certain. "I think he is." And Noah seemed satisfied with that, leaning back against her again, his eyes drifting closed once more as if the answer itself had given him something to hold on to. Outside, the city lights began to appear one by one, faint glows filtering through the blinds, and Emily looked toward the window, her thoughts quiet now, not racing, not calculating, just present, and for the first time in a long while, she did not feel like she was standing alone against everything, not because someone had taken her place, not because anything had been solved completely, but because something had reached her without asking her to change who she was, without asking her to give up her strength in order to accept it. She looked back at Noah, her hand still holding his, and she understood something then, something simple but important, that needing help did not erase what she had done, it did not diminish the nights she had stayed awake, the days she had carried more than she should have, it simply meant that sometimes, the world answered in quiet ways when you needed it most. The room grew dimmer as evening settled fully, but the small lamp beside the couch cast a warm glow that filled the space just enough, and Emily Carter sat there, steady, present, her hand in her son's. Her heart no longer braced against everything, and though she did not know what tomorrow would bring, she knew one thing with quiet certainty: she had not needed to ask for help for it to find her, and that did not make her weaker, it simply meant she had been seen.